All right, here we go with our fifth and grand finale for chapter 10, which is all about East Asia. So we're going to start with Chinese religions. As I already stated before, Buddhism becomes increasingly more important and more popular in China after the Han Dynasty. We see an increase in Buddhism during the Tang and the Song dynasties, and there's going to be a backlash against Buddhism during this time, and we could say even a persecution. So what basically happens is that more and more people become Buddhists, and these people start donating their wealth to monasteries, right, as a sense of religious charity. And so these monasteries start getting wealthy. They start accumulating land, and they don't pay taxes because they're churches, they're monasteries. And so the Tang officials realize that they said don't like that these Buddhist people have so much wealth, so much land. After all, it is a foreign religion, and it's kind of like this outside thing. So they don't want Buddhism. So they start persecuting. They close down these churches. They tell these monks that they have to, they can't live there anymore in these monasteries. And we see kind of like this, discrimination against Buddhism. But eventually it goes away. Eventually it stops. By the time the Tang Dynasty collapses, Buddhism is kind of like back to where it was. And the big criticism from the Tang, and which of course are all Confucians, followers of Confucianism, is that Buddhism is kind of like the counter or the opposite, the polar opposite of Confucianism. And so, for example, in Confucianism, they talk about social roles, right? Everyone has a role in society, and everyone needs to do everything in their power to fulfill that role. And that if you don't do your social roles, then you're doing everyone a disservice. Well, in Buddhism, it's not about your social role; it's all about your individual soul, right? So we have this kind of like counter, opposing views about what's most important. Is it your role in society or your individual person? Also, Confucianism is all about family, right? With the ideas of filial piety, and respecting your ancestors, respecting your family, and the relations between husband and wife, and father and son, and brothers and sisters. While Buddhism says don't have families, right? Especially the monks, right? They want to just focus on reaching enlightenment, reaching nirvana. So again, we have these polar opposites. Now, once the Song Dynasty comes up, we see a new development occur within Confucianism. And what the Confucians realize is that they can't really do away with Buddhism because it's growing in popularity, so instead they're going to modify Confucianism, and this eventually becomes known as Neo-Confucianism or New Confucianism. And New Confucianism is going to incorporate, is going to adopt some of the spiritual beliefs of Buddhism and also Taoism, right, which is the third religion that's there. And so they're going to start bringing in these ideas about salvation and happiness. So it's not just about like your role in society and keeping society up and running. It's also about making yourself happy and finding joy in life and stuff like that. So Neo-Confucianism is going to bring a resurgence to its popularity, right? Confucianism is going to be popular again because the Chinese are going to be able to kind of like pick and choose, what parts of Taoism they like, what parts of Buddhism they like, what parts of Confucianism they like. And this kind of like blended, syncretic religion is going to continue throughout, it become the main religion of China. And eventually it's going to make its way to other parts of East Asia, including Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. So let's talk about those places. All right, so here we see China, modern-day China, of course, and modern-day Korea. Well, back then there was only one Korea, and here's Japan, and down here's Vietnam, right? So we see that the events and the power of China is going to influence these other kind of like surrounding states. So let's start with Japan. So Japan, the story of Japan doesn't really start until around the 600s, when we see that the Japanese are going to start adopting a lot of ideas and culture from China, right? So they're going to develop a very similar pattern of culture and ideas and government as China. And the reason why Japan kind of has been like, we haven't mentioned it, is because for the most part they've been isolated. They're an island off the coast of the rest of Asia, and they really didn't participate in trade and didn't really do much. But now they're going to start, sending diplomats who are going to perform the kowtow to the emperor in China. And now the Japanese, again, they're going to adopt government ideas and cultural ideas and religion. And Japan was, for the most part, because it's a group of islands, it wasn't ever really centralized. It was always decentralized. But by the 600s, 800s, we see that Japan eventually becomes centralized, right, following the model of China. In fact, their capital, which was at that time, it was a city called Nara. It was a copy of of Chang'an, which is the Chinese capital. So they had a merit-based bureaucracy, right, like a civil service exam. They had an emperor who had centralized authority, just like China. Then the next period in Japanese history is called the Heian period. And here we see kind of like how Japan kind of slowly moves away from China, culturally speaking, kind of developed their own identity, cultural identity. We see this in the formation of a new form of Buddhism that develops in Japan, which is a synchronized version of Buddhism. So we call it Zen Buddhism. And it starts mixing in with the traditional Japanese religion, which is called Shintoism, which is animism, really. Like, they believe in different spirits and stuff like that, and they were polytheistic. We also see that Japan, even though they copied or they adopted the Chinese way of writing, they're going to create their own literature. Especially the most famous one is called the Tale of Genji by a woman called Murasaki Shikibu. And this is considered the world's first novel. So women had some prominence within at least the artistic or the cultural level, even though they were still a patriarchal society. So again, Japan's going to adopt Chinese forms of writing. They're going to adopt book printing, and they're going to wear silk, and they're going to also produce silk as well. So here we see Shinto temple. This is the symbol for Shintoism, and there's a lot. It's very kind of like in a similar way to Taoism, when they want to have kind of like a balance between people and nature. Shintoism has those ideas as well. This is the famous book, The Tale of Genji. It's about a prince living in Japan, and this is considered the world's first novel. And they wear these kind of like elaborate outfits. Women, this was a patriarchal society, so women had to be covered up. So even though they weren't veiled, they wear all these kind of like layers after layers after layers of clothing. This is the famous kimono from Japan. And the idea was, to cover up the body because it was, a form of modesty. All right, then we see the next time period, which lasts, throughout the post-classical period, all the way into the period 4, which is the early modern era. And this is known as Feudal Japan, right? So what basically happens is during the period, the Heian period, the emperor slowly starts losing his authority. And basically, instead of being one unified country, we see the divisions, right? And we kind of see here all the different provinces that Japan breaks into, and each province is ruled by a local lord, and each one of these lords are going to be competing against each other to try to dominate that region, right? Try to dominate and become the main ruler in Japan, and so it reverts back to its decentralized state. Japan goes back to decentralization. These local lords are called daimyos. They basically rebel against the emperor, and they say, okay, the emperor, you're not really in charge anymore. And the emperor kind of just becomes like this symbolic leader, because he's still kind of like the head of the religion, but he doesn't have any political authority whatsoever. So the emperors are still there, but they're not really running anything. They're just kind of there for show. And then these local lords, these daimyos, they're gonna try to expand through war. So they're gonna hire soldiers, and the top soldiers are aristocratic soldiers that are known as the samurai, and they're gonna fight for the daimyos, and they're gonna fight against each other. Right, so one daimyo, one lord against another, and eventually we see that one clan is gonna be able to conquer enough territories to rule most of Japan. And most of the territories within Japan, and this is a family called the Minamoto family, and they don't claim themselves as emperor, because they kind of like keep the emperor there as the symbolic leader, but they do claim political power, centralized political dictatorship. and this is known as the shogun. So in Japan, we have a shogunate type of government, meaning, ruled by a shogun, which is kind of like a military dictator. But the shogun's power, it wasn't absolute. It was limited because they had to work with the daimyos, because if they didn't work with the daimyos will rebel against them, and they'll continue fighting. And that tended to happen quite a lot. So there was no centralized authority, not really, because of all these people fighting against each other. So here we see the samurai. Notice, of course, that this is a photograph. So, the samurais lasted into the modern era. The shogun would be the military leader of Japan, and different families will compete for that title, and it'll go from one family to the next. They'll build these castles, as their headquarters. That's where the shoguns or the daimyos or the samurai might live. And it's very, 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 very similar to what's going to be happening in Europe during the same exact time, which is known as European feudalism. So feudalism is the breaking down of society, where we have these social classes that are hereditary, right? So we have the peasants or the serfs. They work the land. They don't own the land. They don't own anything. They can't leave the land. They have to work there unless they get permission from the lord. Then we also have the samurai, which are the Japanese version of knights, right? The European knights. And these are part of the upper class. They're nobles, they're aristocrats. They follow some type of honor code. Like in Japan, the samurai follow Bushido, which is the way of the warrior. And the European knights, they follow the code of chivalry. And above them, we have the daimyos, which are the lords. They were landowners. They owned the land that the serfs worked on. They divided their land between their samurai. So the samurai, they would get paid in land, basically. So the samurais would have serfs, or the knights would have serfs working under them, providing all the food and necessities they might want or need. Above them, we have the kings, or the shogun. But in Europe, the kings actually had some power over their lords, but the shogun in Japan really didn't have that much power. And however, the European kings, they had to answer to the Pope, who was the spiritual leader, while the shogun didn't really have to answer to the Pope, or not the Pope, to the emperor, because even though the emperor was a religious leader. So again, here we have the social structure of feudal Japan. The emperor, even though he's the top of society, he has no political power for the most part. The shogun has a lot of political power, but is not 100% centralized, because they have to fight and share it with the daimyos. The daimyos share land and wealth with the samurai who fight for them, and the samurais directly supervise and protect the peasants. All right, next we have Vietnam, right? Vietnam is, in Southeast Asia, right? But for a long time it was conquered by Japan for about 800, 900 years. China was ruled over most of Vietnam. However, we see that there was a resistance against the process called Sinification. Sinification is simply the adoption or the spread of Chinese culture. So it's kind of like Hellenization or Romanization. Well, now we have Sinification. And Vietnam did not accept Sinification. They rejected it. And we see it specifically in the status of women. So in Vietnam, women had almost equal status. They had the rights to inherit property. They had the rights to have multiple husbands. They even ruled, as queens or clan leaders. So Vietnamese women had all these kind of like, almost equal status, a lot of rights. And then the Chinese kind of like try to restrict those, right? Because of course the Chinese are super patriarchal. But the Vietnamese rejected it. They even rebelled multiple times. There were even women who rebelled against the Chinese rulers. So stuff like foot binding, we never see that be adopted in Vietnam. But they did adopt the Chinese form of writing, even though they had their own written, their own language. They did write down the way the Chinese do. They also adopt Buddhism, which spread through, from India to China and China to Vietnam. And in fact, even nowadays, Vietnam is still mainly a Buddhist country. But we do see that, again, the Vietnamese were ruled by China for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they were very closely tied, especially economically. So they would trade quite a lot. From China, from Vietnam, it is where the Chinese get the champa rice, right? That fast-growing, fast-ripening rice that makes it possible for them to have multiple harvests per year and therefore increase their economy and their population. They also traded different luxury goods like pearls and porcelain and ivory and stuff like that. All right, so here we're seeing some of those exports: the rice, champa rice, pearls, and turtle shells, which was popular as well. But eventually Vietnam does fight and rebel and win their independence, especially as the Tang dynasty was collapsing. And the Vietnamese rulers, once they become independent, they weren't ever really able to centralize. So Vietnam was kind of like broken up into different mini countries, mini states. They did have the civil service exam, but it wasn't as expansive or as available to the people as it might have been in China. And the reason why the Vietnamese, which is a tiny, tiny country, were able to kind of overthrow and kick out the Chinese is because they used guerrilla warfare, meaning that they will practice hit-and-run tactics. So the Chinese army will be marching on the road, the Vietnamese will come out of the jungle, attack them, and then run away. And the Chinese army, would fail to be able to capture these people or like run after these people, because after all, the Vietnamese are fighting on their home turf, while the Chinese are fighting in a foreign place. All right, last thing we're looking at is going to be Korea. So Korea, again, was also broken up into different kingdoms. The main one is called Silla. And for part of their history, Korea was controlled directly by China. They ruled over northern Korea. And then, but eventually the Koreans were able to, were able to separate themselves from China. But they remained what we call a vassal state, which meaning that they had to pay tribute to China. So every year the Koreans had to send money and send diplomats, and the diplomats would perform the kowtow and bow down in front of the emperor, and they had to pay tribute. But through Korea, through China, Koreans were able to adopt the Chinese culture, and we kind of see the same thing as in Japan, right? Where Korea, their capital, they're going to copy the Chinese capital of Chang'an, just like the Japanese copied their capital from China as well. Neo-Confucianism will come to Vietnam. Chinese writing will come to Korea. Chinese writing will also come to Korea. Buddhism will also come to Korea. So we see again Chinese culture spreading into Korea, right? What we call Sinification of Korea. So Korean Buddhism, it becomes popular. But the one thing that doesn't come to Korea from China is the civil rights, the civil service exam. So the bureaucracy is not a merit-based bureaucracy. It remained in the control of the aristocrats and the nobles and the wealthy landowners, and peasants were not allowed to take the exam. So it wasn't like open to